So now we move on to the second part of this chapter, and that is the notion of knowledge by description. It can be very difficult exposition to follow here on the part of Russell, and I think that there are some ambiguities, and I'll tell you right away what I think the ambiguity is. And I think maybe Russell recognized this himself and revised his notion here of knowledge by description. He has clearly said that the only things that let me put it this way, that we cannot know ordinary physical objects in the world by acquaintance. We can only know them by description. We know the sense data that we associate with those objects by acquaintance, but the objects themselves that we take to be in the world, we can only know by description. However, in his exposition, he seems to indicate that particular things in the world we can also know by acquaintance as opposed to description, and that is an important ambiguity or confusion in the exposition, but I think it's understandable. Let's take a particularly confusing, and I think when you read it, funny passage in this regard. Russell says, "Thus, when we are acquainted with an object, which is the so-and-so, we know that the so-and-so exists. But we may know that the so-and-so exists when we are not acquainted with any object, which we know to be the so-and-so, and even when we are not acquainted with any object, which in fact is the so-and-so." Now, on a first read, that seems like comedy, right? It seems like a joke, but it actually it makes perfect sense once we realize that when he says the so-and-so, you can substitute any phrase of the form, say, the man who shot Liberty Valance, the child with the highest vertical leap in the class, the house at the corner of Broad and Market. That is, when you replace the so-and-so with anything, any description of a thing, or any mention of a thing and a property of a thing. So he says, "Thus, when we are acquainted with an object, which is the so-and-so, we know that the so-and-so exists." So there it seems that he's saying that we can be acquainted with objects in the world besides our sense data, and you know, in the sense in which you are acquainted with anybody that you actually met, that you know. When we are acquainted with an object, which is the so-and-so, we know that the so-and-so exists. So if I'm acquainted, let's say, with this coffee cup, in the ordinary sense of acquainted with it, I've looked at it, I've touched it, I've been in its presence, I know that it exists if I'm acquainted with it. That is, I can't really be acquainted with anything that doesn't exist, I guess, because if it didn't exist, I wouldn't be acquainted with it. So if I'm acquainted with something, then logically I have to infer from that the thing exists, necessarily. But we may know that the so-and-so exists when we are not acquainted with any object which we know to be the so-and-so. That is, this is really the crux of it, and I think this is what is important in Russell's distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. And it's right there that we may know that something, the so-and-so, exists when we are not acquainted with any object which we know to be the so-and-so, and even when we are not acquainted with any object which in fact is the so-and-so. That is, we can know that things exist without being acquainted with them. But how, really? I mean, that is, if I'm not acquainted with something, how can I know that it exists? Well, I think what Russell would say is that you're not acquainted with the thing, but you know truths about the thing, and you know it in that sense. So let's take acquainted with in the ordinary way. I'm acquainted with my brother, and because I'm acquainted with him, I know that he exists. I am not acquainted with Barack Obama. However, that does not mean that I don't know that he exists. Because although I'm not acquainted with him, I know a lot of truths about him. I might have said this before. I know his history as a teacher, as a politician, as a great high school basketball player too. I don't know why he didn't play in college. I guess he had other plans, like being president of the United States. But I know a bunch of truths about him, and he is the so-and-so in the sense that, let's say, he is the man who defeated John McCain in the election of 2008. That is, I know that he exists because I know that and other truths about him. Moreover, I know multiple truths about him. And what I presume is that if I say, well, the man who beat John McCain in the election of 2008, the man who was a law professor at the University of Chicago, but turned down tenure because he wanted to pursue politics, the man who is up for re-election for President of the United States in 2012, all these descriptions refer to the same object. And although I do not know by acquaintance that object, that person in this case, Barack Obama, I know that all of those truths, all of those descriptions, which are really all of these properties or characteristics, refer to the same object in the world, and that's Barack Obama. He gives the example of Bismarck, the great German politician, the sort of founder of modern Germany in the late 19th century. None of us know Bismarck by acquaintance, but we know truths about him. And this goes for all historical figures, all people that we haven't met, all things in the world that we're not directly acquainted with, that although we cannot be acquainted with them, we can know them. But we know them through what Russell calls definite descriptions. And really, what does that mean, a definite description? It means the pointing out of a thing in the world and the isolation of a characteristic of that thing in the world that in a certain way locates or defines or singles out that thing in the world. Because I cannot know Bismarck directly, or I cannot be acquainted with him. But when I say, the man who is primarily responsible for the founding of the modern German state, I have articulated a truth about Bismarck, and I don't know him directly, but I know that truth about him. So in that sense, I know him.